What if the biggest secret of the Madeline case lay precisely with the one person who was never thoroughly investigated? Today, you're going to uncover the hidden details about David Payne and understand why so many avoid talking about him. Picture an ordinary dining room: white tablecloth, wooden chairs, muffled laughter, clinking glasses. Everything seems normal, but there's one detail. Outside, a child vanishes, and inside, amid rehearsed smiles and glances that avoid meeting, sits a man who was never truly questioned: David Payne. While the world turned against Madeline's parents, while reporters hounded investigators and theories sprouted on every corner of the internet, he remained unscathed, always there, but never at the center of suspicion. What if I told you there are details about this man that never reached you? That there are statements about him that disappeared, that some people tried to raise the alarm, but were ignored? The most uncomfortable truth might not lie in what was investigated, but in what they chose not to investigate. David Payne isn't a minor figure in this case. He was close to the family, present in the most sensitive moments, and mentioned in unsettling accounts. Yet he remained a shadow, present in every photo, but absent from nearly every suspicion. There are contradictions in what he says, and there's a pattern of silence that keeps repeating. Statements involving Payne vanish, are ignored, or simply set aside. The problem isn't just what he did or didn't do. It's the fact that, in a case with so many questions, no one seems willing to ask the most obvious one: why wasn't David Payne thoroughly investigated? This video won't hand you a ready-made theory. It'll show you the pieces that were left out and let you put the puzzle together yourself. After all, the silence surrounding David Payne isn't natural. It's constructed, it's maintained, it's protected. Let's talk about the statements that disappeared, the strange behavior no one wanted to examine closely, the moments when Payne was where he shouldn't have been, and the whys that were never answered. If you've always felt there was something missing in this case, maybe it's because no one looked at the man who stood in the corner of the frame the whole time. So come with me, because sometimes what no one is saying is exactly what needs to be said the most. Imagine someone who's everywhere, but no one sees, always nearby, but never in the spotlight. That was David Payne in the Madeline case, a doctor, a family man, a close friend of the McCanns, and yet a name that almost never makes the headlines. During that vacation in Portugal, Payne was part of the group known as the Tapas Seven, the friends who dined every night at the resort's restaurant while the children slept in their rooms. The routine seemed rehearsed: check-ins on the kids, jokes at the table, white wine, and a false sense of control. But on May 3rd, 2007, that bubble burst. On the night of the disappearance, David Payne was an active piece. He was among those doing the so-called checks on the kids. According to his own statement, he was the one who saw Kate and the children around 6:30 p.m., a detail that seems trivial, but would place Payne as one of the last people to see Madeline alive. And even with that information, he was never investigated as a direct suspect. Not by the Portuguese authorities, not by the British. Why not? It's the kind of question that seems simple until you realize no one ever bothered to answer it properly. Payne shows up in nearly every key account, organizing the check-in schedules, coordinating who went and who returned to the table, taking part in critical conversations. He was close enough to know everything, yet distant enough to go unnoticed. But if every group has a weak link, maybe Payne is exactly that, the piece that holds it all together without ever drawing attention to himself. And this is where the tension builds, because the more you look, the more David Payne's invisible role starts to seem too convenient. One example: the timeline. While other group members contradicted themselves or hesitated in their accounts, Payne was clear, direct, confident, too confident. He knew exactly where he was, what he did, who he saw. But the problem is, the others didn't always back him up. In some parts, his version doesn't match the times described by other friends. In others, he seems to know things he shouldn't, unless he was in more places than he let on. And here comes an unsettling idea: silence as protection. Sometimes what clears you isn't what you say, it's what others choose not to say about you. Payne seems shielded, not officially, but socially. None of the friends openly question him. No one seems uncomfortable around him. It's as if there's an unspoken pact or a blind trust that borders on recklessness. This is where the concept of complicit silence starts to make sense. When Foucault said power reveals itself in what's silenced, he was talking about exactly this. In every social structure, there are figures who escape suspicion simply because their position makes questioning them inconvenient. Payne was a doctor, a family man, educated, composed. To question him would be like admitting no one there was safe, and maybe they weren't. The official version always focused on the parents. But what if the truth was hiding in a darker corner, in a discreet presence that was there the whole time, but no one dared to face? Because the story told so far might just be the tip of the iceberg, and David Payne might be what's submerged. But when you start piecing together the forgotten bits, the diverted statements, the odd reactions, the ignored details, the picture changes. And what comes next might be even more uncomfortable. After everything that's been said, what remained was silence. But not just any silence. It was that thick silence that fills a room when no one knows where to look. Or worse, when everyone knows exactly where not to look. With every step forward in Madeleine's case, David Payne retreated further into the shadows. Except shadows have a sound too. And in his case, that sound came in the form of forgotten whispers, statements that surfaced, who described strange behavior between Payne and another group member. She didn't name names, didn't accuse, but left something hanging in the air, something unsettling. In another account, a former neighbor described a visit from Payne to the McCann's house days before the trip. She found his way with the kids odd, but thought it was just in her head. Looking back now, she says she wishes she hadn't ignored her gut. That night, Payne said he went to the McCann's apartment around 6:30 p.m. He said everything was calm, that he saw Kate and the kids. But the timing doesn't match what others reported. A difference of minutes that, in that context, means a lot, and more. In one of the most watched videos of the case's coverage, Payne is seen laughing nervously during an interview, while Jerry McCann is visibly tense. The camera zooms in on his face, and for a second, the laugh feels out of place, almost as if he's seeing something else, feeling something else. And it wasn't fear. Why was he laughing? Nerves? Discomfort? Or just another social shield? This is where the question no one likes to ask comes in. What happens when someone is protected not by a lack of evidence, but because no one wants to know what might happen if it's taken seriously? David Payne was never formally accused of anything, but he's too loose a piece to go unnoticed. The timeline has holes. The emotional reactions don't match the gravity of the situation. And above all, there's a collective effort not to look at him, as if doing so would make the group's perfect image crumble entirely. There's a name for this: cognitive dissonance. When the brain chooses to believe a comfortable version, even in the face of uncomfortable facts. And this doesn't just affect those involved, it affects the investigators, the viewers, the commentators. Because admitting the focus might have been misplaced means saying everything done so far could be wrong. What if it was a stranger in the village, an unknown guest with the same background, the same gaps, the same reactions? Would they have been treated the same? But because David Payne was a friend, a doctor, part of the group, he became part of what sociology calls collective forgetting, a social mechanism that decides who gets remembered and who gets sidelined for convenience. The Portuguese police touched on his name, but then silence fell. The media mentioned it, but quickly moved on. The public suspected, but preferred to stick to the familiar. It was easier to focus on the parents, the police failures, the sensationalism. But now, with all the pieces on the table, Payne's outline doesn't seem so blurry anymore. And just when you think you've seen it all, the most unsettling details emerge, the ones that were omitted, hushed up, or dismissed as irrelevant. That's when the truth becomes impossible to ignore. At this point in the story, one thing is clear: David Payne didn't fade from the narrative because he had nothing to do with it, but maybe because he had too much. He was close enough to hear, see, participate, but distant enough never to be pressed to speak. And it's in that strategic distance that omission gains strength. In the end, Payne might not have been the hidden villain some hoped to uncover. Maybe he never did anything directly. But what he didn't do, that's where the point lies. Because some people don't lie, they just choose silence as a way to protect the whole. He was there in the conversations, the outings, the decisions. It was he who reportedly went to the McCann's apartment that night to check if everything was okay. It was he who gave statements that didn't align with others. And it was he who reacted with a strangely light, almost cynical demeanor in the face of a tragedy that gripped the entire world. When you put all these pieces together, what forms isn't exactly a portrait. It's an edge, an absence with a defined shape. Like when a piece is missing from the center of a puzzle, you don't see the full picture, but you know what's not there. And it's that missing piece that makes everything else feel off. What David Payne represents goes beyond a name or a statement. He's the symbol of the part of the story that was shielded by collective silence. The piece that doesn't fit, not because it's wrong, but because it was never put on the table. In psychology, there's a saying that hits hard. What's avoided isn't forgotten. It's just buried alive. And Payne, over the years, became exactly that. A living reminder of what no one wanted to face. The face everyone knows, but no one mentions. And when the omission is too big, it leaves traces. Traces of discomfort, of doubts, of questions never asked out loud. So here's the question that stings more than any direct accusation. What if Payne wasn't guilty of a crime, but as the missing link to understanding how silence spread through the entire case? Because every cover-up needs more than lies. It needs someone who holds back at the right moment, who looks away, who laughs when others cry, who's always there, but never remembered as someone significant. It's as if he were the foundation of an invisible wall, one built to protect those who couldn't be touched, but which, in hindsight, shows too many cracks. When Jung said, "Until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life," maybe he was talking about cases like this too. About the collective unconscious of a society that prefers a visible villain over grappling with the possibility that the accomplices were too close, sitting at the same table, saying the same lines, toasting together while everything slowly fell apart. And when you get that, you realize the mistake might never have been who did it, but who stayed silent. In this story, David Payne might not be the final puzzle piece, but he might be the hole in the center, the piece that was never slotted in because it would show that everything else was built on shaky ground. Maybe what's most terrifying about this case isn't what happened to Madeleine, but what happened to the truth, and how many people, actively or not, helped bury it under layers of convenience. His omission became the symbol of something bigger. How much we're willing to ignore as long as the story stays intact. How much we'd rather believe the cozier version, even when it doesn't fit. And that's why, at the end of the story, the question isn't, what did Payne do? But, why didn't anyone want to know? And when you start looking at him from that angle, everything changes. Because the question was never just who acted, but who allowed it. And maybe in the quietest corners of this case lies the answer no one's had the courage to face until now. David Payne never made the headlines as center stage, but maybe he should have. Not because he holds all the answers alone, but because he reveals the questions no one wanted to ask. Through everything we've seen so far, one thing's hard to ignore. Payne was always in the thick of it, yet somehow seemed off stage. The man everyone knew but about whom almost no one spoke. The only one whose name popped up in statements that disappeared. The only one who spoke too calmly when everyone else was in chaos. The only one who, even within the puzzle, didn't seem to fit anywhere. That doesn't make him guilty, but it makes it impossible to overlook the role he played, or didn't play, on a night that would forever change a family's life and the world's trust in what we call justice. And when we go back to the images, the words, the little details swept under the rug, we start to see that the Madeleine case might never have been just about direct guilt. Maybe it was about the silence around the guilt, about who stayed quiet when they could have spoken, about who chose to say, "I didn't see anything," when they were right in front of it all. It's as if all this time we've been trying to solve a puzzle without realizing one of the pieces was upside down. It was there, yes, from the start, but no one bothered to look at it properly. And Payne, in this whole picture, is exactly that. The piece we thought we knew, but which, when flipped, reveals an entirely different side. Looking at everything laid out here, it's impossible to pretend it's just coincidence. The muddled timelines, the shifting statements, the witnesses who dropped off the map, the uncomfortable accounts that were never dug into, and above all, the almost rehearsed absence of any unease, as if the whole world was sweating, but he wasn't. This is where what bothers me most comes in, because it's not just about what David Payne did or didn't do. It's about what everyone around him made a point not to see. There's something deeply wrong when a case with so many odd elements, so many ignored red flags, so many versions that don't align, chooses to keep as untouchable the one person floating above the mess. And this is where I ask you, as honestly as I can, what if the biggest mistake in this case wasn't a lack of evidence, but an excess of convenience? What if, deep down, we accepted a simplified version because looking at Payne would mean facing a discomfort no one wanted to deal with? These questions aren't easy. They unsettle. They pull the ground out from under you. But maybe that's exactly why they need to be asked. Because if we don't have the guts to face the gaps in the story, we'll just keep repeating the ready-made versions, the ones that serve more to close the case than to open the truth. And now, with everything you've seen so far, tell me, do you still think David Payne was just another member of the group? Or was he the blind spot that everyone case still holds more questions than answers? Then what's coming next will hit you even harder. The next video uncovers what's been hidden behind the scenes with the Tapa 7, and it's not gossip or guesswork. These are recorded details, forgotten, and now resurfacing with force. It's the natural continuation of the thread we've started pulling here, and it'll shake everything you thought you understood about this story. So if you've made it this far, comment, "I'm the eyes that were missing," just so I know you stuck with me to the end, looking where few have looked. And if you want to keep going on this journey with me, subscribe to the channel, not to follow content, but to make sure this door doesn't get shut again. Oh, and in the first comment, there's something that didn't fit in the video, but you'll want to see it. I won't explain what it is. Just click. Sometimes what no one says is exactly what matters most. See you there.